Majesty, Mayor Wouters. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us today at this SDG Changemakers event. Welcome at the Danone site here in Rotselaar. And we are very honored, of course, by the presence of Her Majesty the Queen. The Shift and Danone have worked very closely together the last few months to co-create this beautiful event. And of course, it would have been a pleasure for them to welcome you all here in person today, but for reasons we no longer need to explain to all of you, I think you know why this is not an option today. So we're glad you're joining us from home or from work or wherever you are. However, it was possible to invite a few people here on the premises, and we're very glad to have a few people in the room also very welcome. Before telling you what else is on the program this morning, I would like to ask Her Majesty the Queen to share with us her statement on Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Your Majesty.
Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 crisis has brought to light the fragilities of our societies and of our world. The future holds more uncertainties. Inequalities are on the rise. Too many children and young people have dropped out of the education system. More people are facing mental health issues. Many among the most vulnerable are at risk of sliding or falling back into poverty. Reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 will therefore require a renewed and vigorous impulse. We cannot let the COVID crisis distract us from the longer-term objectives we have set for ourselves. On the other hand, when faced with the unexpected challenge of the pandemic, citizens, communities, civil society, the private sector, and governments have demonstrated their capacity to rally and mobilize. We can draw some lessons from this. Tackling unsustainability in all its dimensions is the next urgent challenge. Building sustainable societies should be the next goal, and we need to build back better. There has been progress, undoubtedly, but there are still many gaps. For instance, in mainstreaming sustainability at all levels, in learning to think differently, in developing positive and convincing narratives for all, in sharing knowledge and vision. The time has also come to connect the profusion of innovations for sustainability, which we have witnessed over the years, into a coherent system of mutually reinforcing transformations. For all stakeholders to finally become the owners of a shared vision of the future we want, and for no one to be left behind. Building confidence through all sectors of society will be key. Participation will play a major role. Intelligent communication will be a powerful tool. Your contribution as present and future change makers is also to create and develop concrete solutions. We can help make them understandable and accessible, and you can share your experiences widely. The next generation of leaders, managers, change makers, and citizens is already with us. I hope they will be heard and supported. We owe it to them, and we owe it to the society as a whole. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Majesty, for sharing this statement with us. Now, let me just briefly tell you, ladies and gentlemen, we have a visual harvester processing everything that is going to be said here today in a very creative way. His name is Django Jim, and so you will now and then see a drawing popping up on your screen. Now, how can we integrate the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate challenge into the heart of companies and organizations? That is what we are going to talk about this morning. We'd like to offer you some inspiration, some thoughts, some ideas on the topic, and also we would like to invite you to take action or to inspire other organizations to do so. What's on the agenda? During the first part of this event, we will have the pleasure to listen to Emmanuel Faber, Chairman and CEO of Danone. He will share with us his vision on how Danone can lead as a change maker. After that, we will have a panel discussion with several experts focusing on Sustainable Development Goal number 13, which is climate. And to conclude this event, we will present to you the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action, a community of actors with ambitious climate goals who will gather in a learning network to help each other to achieve these goals. You will find out a lot more about this alliance later on this morning. Now, during the keynote speech of Emmanuel Faber, you can ask questions. Please use the chat on the website for that. Please also mention your name and your organization, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible right after the speech. Your Majesty, Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, it's been 5 years now since the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations have been introduced to the world, the Sustainable Development Priorities for the forthcoming 15 years. So it's an important anniversary today, but can we really celebrate? Not just yet. There's a lot of work to be done. And one of the organizations that has taken up the challenge to become sustainable at heart is Danone. I will now give the floor to the Chairman and CEO of Danone for a keynote speech, and I'd like to remind you that you can ask questions during his talk. How to act as an SDG Changemaker contributing to people and planet. Emmanuel Faber.
Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you so much for your words. Thank you for your work as an SDG advocate. Madam Minister, Mr. Mayor, thank you for being here with us. Yes, change making is what SDGs need, basically. They will not occur by chance. They will occur because our soul, our hearts, our minds, our hands are at work together. And for me, they provide a unique opportunity for us as a species, really, to be successful because we can develop a common language, we can develop a common purpose. At Danone, the question of purpose has started decades ago. We've been pursuing a dual economic and social project since the early 70s, in this country as in many others. And we are delighted to be part of the program of today, and thank you for having me and sharing a few aspects. I think the first thing that needs to occur by trying to put the SDGs at work in a business is to realize that SDGs are not an externality. They are not sitting somewhere in the UN and we are completely disconnected from them. The reality is that SDGs are the constituencies of what ultimately a company, any business, can thrive sustainably. So it's a matter of resilience for our businesses that we achieve these SDGs. So the way we took it was 5 years ago that we designed goals for the company, 9 integrated goals for 2030 that are totally embedded in the SDG language, in the SDGs. What we have started to do is to develop an approach where we could integrate these SDGs into the business system of Danone by working on the indicators, first of all, of the SDGs, connecting these business indicators with our own indicators, working with B Corp, B Lab and B Corp, which is an external certification body that we've been partnering with for 5 years. They have developed with UNGC a set of SDG action managers, a tool basically that connects the B Corp assessment of certification for sustainable management by companies with the SDG language. And Danone has been among the very few first companies to actually use the action managers, the SDG action manager. So we are now piloting this as a tool since about 2 years now. But I would like to just show one example, which is climate. We do not consider climate as something which is outside of our business reach. Since more than 10 years, we started actually to have a CO2 reduction program, which was embedded even in the bonus of our managers. So we have about 100,000 people at Danone. 15,000 of them are team leaders. In 2009, all of them had bonuses, incentives on the fact that they would reduce the CO2 footprint of the part of the business that they were working for. So in this factory, we are now using twice less plastic for the Actimel bottles than when we actually started. On health, we're also using actually twice less sugar than when we actually started. This factory is embarked on a 75% reduction of the water we actually use from the communities here by an investment that we did 2 years ago. And I could go on like this because we are really speaking about managing SDGs as a way to have a company that's going to thrive now, competitive advantage for our brands, but also the long term for our business. When we speak about CO2 and climate, I speak about the resilience of our agricultural and food model. Our food system is broken the way it is managed today. Our agricultural model will not survive climate change. And it's happening now. We're still using too much water for agriculture. We're still emitting too much CO2. The whole of agriculture is actually emitting about the same as the whole of industry in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But we have this unique ability in agriculture that we can sink this carbon back into the soil. And this is why Danone has embarked with all our farmers upstream on a program of regenerative agriculture. We want to promote an agriculture that will create a resilience for the next generation of farmers, for the farmers of the future, but also to make sure that there is farm tomorrow. There is something that will get out of the soil where 40% of soils worldwide are degraded today by the monoculture that our big food model has developed. We need to revert that tide. So integrating the SDGs in our business when it comes to that means that we have taken a position that we should be carbon neutral in the horizon of the SDGs and the overall UN climate agreement of 2015 in Paris. One clear thing that happened, we set our goals for 2015 that in 10 years we would peak our emissions, including agriculture. Well, the good news is that by the hard work of everyone with us, at us, but also with NGOs, governments around ourselves, we've actually reached the peak carbon of our emissions last year. So 5 years ahead of our program, now our emissions have started to go down. Last year they went down by 7%. So it means it's doable. It's doable if we are clear that this is part of what we should do as a business to survive as a business. We went further down the road, integrating these SDGs by actually publishing for the first time this year, in 2020, the first financial results of Danone post-carbon. So we published a post-carbon charge, EPS number, earning per share number. that created a very interesting discussion with our shareholders. Because now that it has gone down, the carbon charge has gone down, it means this post-carbon number is going to grow faster than the accounting number. So suddenly they get interested in the conversation with us about climate. So in a nutshell, I think it takes integrating SDGs in business takes, I think, the vision that they are fundamentally part of the business and we need to take risks for that. The last word I would share is this crisis. We are going through a pandemic that is an evidence of the fact that the way we lived, the way we have managed natural habitats, monoculture in agriculture, urban development is the cause of this pandemic. This pandemic, this virus, has taken the planes, the ships, the trains, exactly the way we are using to transport ourselves and to move around this planet. So it's deeply connected with the way we live. And there will not be a recovery, resilient recovery, if we do not accelerate the agenda for SDGs. And what I would like to say is that I was blessed with the reaction of our shareholders when in the middle of the confinement, we decided to move Danone into the next level of SDG engagement by using the French new status of entreprise à mission, a benefit corporation basically, that allows us to have all our objectives about planet, health, people, inclusiveness, now embedded in the constitution, the law for Danone. So it means that as a board now, we have appointed a set of world experts on these topics that will report publicly on our progress on those. And our board is going to abide by the bylaws of Danone, which means this mission, bring health through food to as many people as possible, which we have had for many, many years. But it's now in the bylaws of the company. And guess what? 99% of our shareholders voted yes that day. So for me, it's a big hope that this recovery will progress and will stick if we accelerate our ability in terms of governance, of indicators, of business integration, to actually accelerate the agenda of SDGs, not to slow it down, please. I mean, it's a call for all of us in business. I know how difficult it is, even absolutely for us as everybody else. We have got so many urgencies to deal with. But there is one that cannot change. It's to build a resilient future. We need that. And we need this courageous tension between the short term and the long term. I know for my colleagues in business that this tension is as high as it has ever been. But that's really the one we need to manage with the conscience that protecting our people is clearly the priority. Our people and the people around them. I think this social crisis, unemployment is going to be critical for the recovery. We, large companies at least, need to be aware of that and making our part to avoid as much as possible the super difficult consequences of growing inequalities. But in the same time, that social justice will not stick without climate justice. And I think this is what the SDGs are teaching up. We are trying to, with many other companies, coalitions of companies that have gathered around us, and we are participating too, because at the end of the day, SDGs number 17 is probably the most important of them, which is collaboration together. There will be a future if it is a future for all of us together. Thank you for your attention, and thank you again for inviting us to share here.
Thank you very much for this beautiful, inspiring speech, Emmanuel Faber. Ladies and gentlemen, Her Majesty the Queen will now take leave, so may I ask you to all rise. Your Majesty, it's been an honor. Thank you very much for your presence here at this SDG Changemakers event. Thank you. And may I ask you to join me here at the desk? Okay, and while Her Majesty is leaving the premises, let's also have a look maybe at what the visual harvester retains from the speeches of Her Majesty and of Emmanuel Faber. Really did receive a few questions, Mr. Faber, from the people following us online. You might have a few questions also here in the room. Of course, we can't react to all of those questions, but we've picked up a few. And the first one is this one. Could you explain how further you embarked or convinced your shareholders on this carbon mitigation journey?
Thank you, Wim. Yes, I think it really started with the fact that they realized, I mean, we brought them to realize that carbon was not somewhere in the air, remote from our business, but that it was, on the contrary, it was in the soil, and it should be in the soil of our farms. Because carbon is 60% of the organic matter in the soil. Without organic matter, there is no soil health and there is no living plants. So if we want those plants to be living, if we want cows to have forage to eat, if we want fruits for our yogurts, etc., we need soil health. I mean, the world needs soil health. So we started that conversation with, in a way, a technical point, not an ideological point, which was very simple. We need carbon back into the soil of our farms. As simple as that. We ruined it in 40 years. We need to rebuild it in 10 years. So that's how it started. And then we discussed about everything that we do to put that carbon back into the soil.
Okay. Another question, relocalized food system, or the food system is urgent to cope with climate change and biodiversity loss to reinforce our resilience. How to conciliate local in a multinational company?
Yes. We have had a vision of food being a local business forever, actually. We are a multi-local company more than a multinational company in many ways. In most of our countries, 90% of what we produce is actually sold in the same country. In this factory here in Rotselaar, we're collecting milk from family farms, which are 50, 70 kilometers away from here. And therefore, we are strong believers that what matters is that the food differences, the traditions, the food cultures, the diets should continue to exist locally because they are based on local natural ecosystems.
Right.
You eat what you grow locally, basically. And there will not be biodiversity if we are not moving back to a much more localized food system. The food system we've built is one in which we rely for 75% of your and my needs, and 7 other billion of people, on only 6 plants. 6 plants around the world, 75% of calorie needs intake. This, frankly, is not sustainable, because if there is just one problem with one of them, we have a big problem. So we need to absolutely make sure that there is a more diverse agriculture in the seeds we choose, the animal species we raise. Climate change is happening right now. There will be an adaptation needs, in any case, which needs those changes to happen. And the only way to make climate change, to make agriculture and food resilient to climate change, is to relocalize it as much as possible.
Right.
Because we will have little clusters that will be much more autonomous one from the other than before. Now, being part of a multi-local company can be a competitive advantage for these local food systems, because you can share best practices, you can share capital, you can share talent that will enrich what the companies, what the brands are able to do locally. So it's really not about being a multi-local company or not. It's how to be a multi-local company that serves local business food systems.
Okay. Another question from one of the viewers is this one. Are SDGs also incorporated in Danone's corporate culture in day-to-day activities? How are employees encouraged to engage with SDGs at their level?
Yeah, I think it's actually a fundamental question, so thank you for asking it, because SDGs will not happen if if only the boardroom or the senior leadership teams believe it's important, let alone the chairman and CEO. It happens if 100,000 people of Danone in 100 countries around the world are convinced that it should happen. So what we started a couple of years ago is a program called One Person, One Voice, One Share, where every person at Danone, every employee is a shareholder of the company, granted one share, and actually now a dividend access scheme that is a multiplier of the dividend attached to this share every year. And now employees are encouraged to even invest a bit of the money that they have available in more shares of the company. So first of all, develop an ownership, a collective ownership standpoint, I think is very important. The much more innovative part of the program is the One Voice. So we've created a system where we consult with our employees every year, 100,000 of employees. On average, we have 90,000 answers. So 90% of people actually answer questions about our 9 goals, our 9 integrated SDG goals, and we ask them, you're here in Rotselaar. In Rotselaar, what do you think should be the priority? Should we cut on plastic? Should we cut, light and free yogurts are being produced here? In November this year, we are going to transition from polystyrene to PET. Which is a recyclable, 100% recyclable material. So this is also driven by the employees of the factory, that they are consulted, they speak, they discuss with the management locally, and they say, we believe the priority is this one, and this one. So they keep engaging with us this way. We collect incredible amount of verbatims, which we deal with artificial intelligence and data mining, so that we elevate them to the board level. And then each year, representatives of our employees, some of them being actually elected by the employees, are meeting with the board of directors of Danone twice a year to discuss the priorities in the next 3 years. So it's a really important and powerful tool. I really believe it's super important because, again, SDGs won't happen if it's only me. And it cannot, and it will never be only me.
Okay. Thank you. We'll come back to that a little bit later during the panel discussion about engaging employees and other stakeholders in the company. Another question is this one. Can you tell us some more about B Corp and why do you choose for the certification?
So B Corp is, to start with, an American-based non-profit organization that delivers certifications of the highest standards of sustainability when it comes to managing businesses. So in essence, they have 200 questions. After a certain threshold, when you answer those questions positively, you can be certified. Okay. A number of companies are just would-be in the movement, but then you can be certified if you're good enough, in a way. The B Corp movement started about a decade ago. They were essentially with smaller companies, and we decided to join as a large multi-local company. We started the journey with them 5 years ago now, and we decided as part of our SDG integrated goals for 2030 to become a B Corp as a total company. So B Corp has never gone through multi-local, multinational, large company certification, so it's been a journey for them, a journey for us. We are 5 years into the journey. Already 50%, about 50% of our sales are covered. So it's a big 12.5 billion euros of worth of brands around the world that are covered. The largest B Corp in the world is our subsidiary in North America that got certified in 2018. So we're making progress on that, and it's very consistent with what we want to do. Because again, B Corp has developed now an SDG Action Manager tool which directly connects the B Corp assessment agenda with the indicators of SDGs. Right.
How is Danone preparing itself for the transition from animal to plant-based food systems? That's also a question that was just came in here.
Yeah. not surprised it came, because I think plant-based is a critical part of the future, not only for Danone, but for humankind, actually, because it's quite clear that if we want to reach the SDGs, if we want to reach the Paris Climate Agreement and the 1.5% degree scenario of science-based targets, we need to change the way we eat and the way we farm. We are eating too much meat. We need to eat less meat and more quality meat. We are producing too much agriculture volumes. They are not of good quality enough. We need better farming. So the two go together. We call them planetary diets, diets that respect the planet boundaries, both from an agricultural standpoint and a health standpoint, because we also know that eating too much animal proteins, as we've seen in the US to start with, unfortunately also now in Europe, but in many other places, leads to obesity, overweight, and diabetes. So we strongly advocate for flexitarian, because in the same time it's very clear that, in particular for the dairy protein, we can discuss that later on if there is interest, so I won't be long on this, but the dairy protein is the only one that is protective from an amino acid standpoint declared by the health authorities. So we will always need that. And agriculture will always need cattle raising and animal farming as part of a broader ecosystem of agriculture, but a different one from today. So flexitarian and plant-based is at the core of Danone's agenda. We've bought in this country a family business that's an amazing pioneer called Alpro in Wevelgem, and not so far from here. So we are the happy owner of Alpro. Alpro has actually become a B Corp now as part of the Danone family, and they are really, for us, the pioneers. And we are pushing the Alpro system in now many, many countries where Danone is already. In this factory, we've actually invested this year to just launch, as we speak, a new Actimel version, which is a plant-based Actimel version, in particular with almond protein in it. And so we are transitioning our own brands and product ranges into this flexitarian space, which is also a very growing space where we see in the pandemic many people turning to more flexitarian diets as well.
Right. Maybe we can take the next question from the room. Is there a question in the room somewhere? Yes, over there. Yeah, please tell us who you are and what your question is.
Hi, Bart Ridder, Accenture. First of all, congratulations and thank you for being such an inspirational leader in responsible business and in sustainability. Now, I think France, you're ahead with the Entreprise à Mission, and also you're part of the group of 35 companies in France as well. I think in the rest of the world and in Belgium as well, we are realizing that we need to accelerate. So my question to you is what would be your advice to us here in Belgium to accelerate on the SDG?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think you know what, I'll put it this way. The change in the law in France really helped. It's been a big debate, to be honest with you. I mean, even in business circles, Le MEDEF and AFEP and others, there were very harsh debates about whether it was a good or a bad idea to actually, in a way, extend the responsibility of companies beyond their business as usual kind of responsibilities. We were amongst the people that pushed for that change, and that change at the end of the day occurred. I think it made a big change, and it will be a big change for the whole of the France economy, hopefully. We've been advocating for that at the European level, because I think today, clearly there is a need for Europe to rethink about what is economy in Europe. It cannot be the financial way of looking at things of the US. It cannot be the state-driven or influenced way of doing business of China. So we're in the middle here, and it's an opportunity for us to reinvent the way we want to design what is oikosnomia, the role of economy, which is how we manage together this home that we have in common. In Belgium, I've been, for long decades, I think there is this tradition of at least family capitalism that existed in many ways where, beyond what happened in France, where in the old way, I would say, those families, those businesses were taking care of their ecosystems beyond the strict boundaries. It tends to disappear, and we need to replace it with something else. But you could go back to the roots of what businesses meant in Belgium, 50, 100 years ago, and I think you will find the same, this same idea that the company has a broader responsibility than its ecosystem in its ecosystem than purely what it is legally defined to be. And my encouragement would be that from that you would discuss with the government, because we have having the same discussions in Germany, the same in the Netherlands. The UK has already changed its law. The US has changed its law. I mean, believe it, they've been the first in the world to allow for public benefit corporations to exist. So my encouragement is looking at what happens around the countries of Belgium as a matter of competitiveness for the Belgian industry, work with the government here to try to get that change in the law as well. Other than this, I would say, obviously, the encouragement is the more companies you'll find to move as SDG Changemakers, the easier it will be for all of you. I'm very clear on the fact that we need to act together. These coalitions, whether they're formal or informal, in the absence of government move, I think that a broad enough, a big enough coalition of companies, if they want to do it, they can make that change together. But I don't have a magic recipe. It's super hard, but I think that's it's every country, every group of companies to find their own ways into that.
Thank you. We have a lot more questions coming in, but unfortunately we don't have time for more. So I would like to thank you for submitting questions. Thank you for answering the questions. And may I ask you to join me to the other side of the room for the next part of our event. Thank you. We will now have a panel discussion on one of the SDGs, SDG 13, Climate Action. More in particular, this Sustainable Development Goal urges us to take action and to combat climate change and its impact. So how can we act together upon the Paris Climate Agreement? To talk about this, the Shift and Danone have invited a few experts to share their knowledge and expertise with us. And I would like to welcome them. Jean-Pascal van Ypersele, past vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and also involved in the Earth and Life Institute at the UCL. Ester, who is director at WWF in Europe. Emmanuel Faber, we've seen you earlier this morning, of course. And unfortunately, I have to say, Jacques van der Meijere, the CEO of the Port of Antwerp and president of the Shift, couldn't be with us today. But very welcome. And I have a first question maybe for Jean-Pascal van Ypersele. How would you describe the current climate situation? And in your opinion, is it still possible to reach the targets of the Paris Agreement?
Well, let's take the first question first. I think the urgency is maximal. I mean, if you look at the diagram, you'll see in a second, I hope, on this screen, which is the animated version. Would it be possible to have it here as well?
Yes, we'll see it here. You'll see it right here. Yeah.
Which is the animated version of my tie and my mask.
I can see
actually,
that. Yeah.
Because this is the.
By the way, if you feel more comfortable taking off the mask, you can. We're more than 1.5 meter apart from each other.
The rule in my university, and this is guided by the science of airborne transmission, is that it is unsafe to do as you are doing, actually.
Okay.
And you will probably talk about that in a few weeks in Belgium, about this is the airborne transmission of the virus. So I'm following the rules we apply in my university.
Okay.
So this is the what you're seeing here on the left is the increase with time since 1850 of the concentration of CO2. And I like this presentation because it suggests, the increase in thickness of the insulation layer that CO2 constitutes together with the other greenhouse gases, but CO2 is really the main anthropogenic greenhouse gas around the planet. And because the thickness of that insulation layer increases, well, under that layer, it's getting warmer and warmer. And you see that on the right, and that's where the animated version of both my tie and my mask are seen, because this is the temperature evolving in parallel, and you see the increase since the end of the 19th century in that global temperature. We have gained more than 1 degree C already, and we're getting closer and closer to the reddish line you see there, which is the 1.5 degrees C limits mentioned in the Paris Agreement. So the urgency is maximal, because as we continue to increase the thickness of the CO2 layer, because of our emissions, of course, well, we are getting closer and closer to that limit in temperature. Limit in temperature, which is also accompanied by big changes in extreme events, such as heat waves, which are killing more and more people. Just this summer, we had 1,500 people dying in Belgium, not to COVID, but due to the heat waves, which was not so long. It was 70,000 in 2003 in Europe, for example. We also have floods because of extreme rain becoming more and more common. And the IPCC, just 2 years ago, this week actually, published a special report on the differences in consequences between 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C. Just half a degree, and it makes a big difference. Right. So every fraction of a degree actually matters in terms of avoided impacts. But the same report also showed that to stay under 1.5 degrees C, and this is now related to your second question, what is needed is to reach, before the middle of this century, carbon neutrality. That means not emitting more than what natural systems, including the soils we have heard from Emmanuel Faber, can absorb. Soils and forests and vegetation. And now, if we can get the second slide, we are very far from seeing that, because if you collect the commitments announced up to now in the framework of the Paris Agreement, you get in those small rectangles there a little lower in 2025 and 2030 than the business as usual curve, which is of course the top orange curve in terms of global emissions of CO2. But as you can see, it's still very far from the green curve, which is heading towards zero, that zero number that we are shooting for in 2050 at the latest, if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees C. So there's still a lot of work. The announcement at the European level that the EU would reach carbon neutrality by 2050 is good news if it's realized, which still needs to be demonstrated. But Europe should actually do it earlier than 2050, because this is a number at the world level, and the EU has a historical responsibility, which is very significant, and also has the means and the technology, the far-sighted companies who are ready to do it. So we should do it actually earlier than that. So the challenge is there, but I'm convinced that it's possible to do it if there is enough political will and also enough will among economic actors like we are hearing today.
Right. Thank you very much for elaborating on that. Now, Ester, Astin, we often hear that climate change and the loss of biodiversity influence one another heavily. Could you illustrate this interdependence?
It's a science-based organization. I put my mask on to follow the science advices. Indeed, for us in WWF, the climate and the biodiversity are the two sides of the same coin. And we just published in September our flagship report that is called the Living Planet Report 2020. And the findings are very dear. Huh? We are seeing more intense, more damaging forest fires. We are living through a pandemic. We are seeing unsustainable use of land and the sea. And one of the findings is that we've lost, in less than 50 years, I'm 47, so in less my time on Earth, we've lost 68% of the species of mammals, vertebrates, fish, birds, and others. So this is not just threatening the plants and the species that we care as WWF, it's threatening the foundations of our own society and economy. And I'll illustrate with an example. And you can see there what Professor Van Ypersele was saying, what makes the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, and it's massive. And I'll give you maybe an example with forest. Forest today, as I said before, we are seeing really very intense forest fires. And we all know that forests we call the lungs of our planet, and they are home to amazing biodiversity, to amazing species. But for instance, in Australia, we see that the extreme heat wave and the drought causes the fires. But actually, today, more than 75% of these forest fires are caused by us, by the humans. Why? Because then we want to use the land for monocultures, to grow pasture, for grain growing our cows and in other places of the world and in Europe. So what happens with you have the forest? First, we are losing a rich ecosystem, but at the same time, we are releasing vast amounts of greenhouse gases emissions into the atmosphere. So today, forest fires account, and Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, for about 10% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And at the same time, the land that remains cannot absorb any more CO2. An example that you can see in the graph is about the coral reefs, what we call the coral bleaching. For instance, if we reach 1.5 degrees, we might lose 60–90% of all coral reefs. But if we reach 2 degrees, we lose them all. And it's not just lose a nice species, it's actually as a mass extinction, but it's also threatening the millions of people that rely on corals for food, for income, but also for coastal protection, against the floods. And as Professor Van Ypersele said, now we are seeing, massive heat waves, droughts, floods everywhere. And this is not just an environmental problem or a climate problem. It's really threatening our own health. Mm-hmm. It's threatening our own security. So we risk going backwards in many years of progress in terms of health and well-being if we don't act now.
Okay. Now, Jean-Pascal Van Ypersele, how can we do better then to mitigate the climate change, in your opinion?
Well, I was invited by the UN Secretary General 3 years ago to participate to a group of authors writing the Global Sustainable Development Report, which was published last year, looking at the 17 SDGs, not only climate. And a very strong conclusion of that report, which is also in another way a conclusion of the special report that the IPCC published 2 years ago, is that when you look at synergies between different sustainable development goals and between different measures and policies to try to reach them, it's actually much easier to reach those goals than when you have a silo approach, looking at one goal after the other one. There are multiple synergies between protection of biodiversity that Ester mentioned a minute ago and climate protection. There are multiple opportunities and synergies between climate protection and job creation, for example. If we have to insulate, just to take an example, all our buildings to make them much more energy efficient, it's a huge economic opportunity for the building sector and for the economy as a whole, just to give one example.
Right.
So if we could, cut the walls between the different silos and look at things in a more holistic way, we would move forward much better.
Okay. Now, if I may, I would like to bring in a question from a young change maker. And young change makers are young entrepreneurs between the age of 18 and 35 who are really at the forefront of sustainable transition. And they are eager to engage into discussions and talks with other individuals and organizations. And for 1 year, they now challenge the projects and the members of the Shift. And we have a question here from Hannes de Reu. How do you transform a business model in the right direction? What would be your advice to start that journey? Emmanuel Faber, maybe you can answer this question.
Thank you. Well, I guess in a way I was trying probably to say a few words about this earlier.
Yes.
I think my first point is that to really look at experiences that have been successful about this. My personal journey, when it says about starting the journey, you know, I've been raised in the mountains. I was educated close to a farm, and so nature and all these topics are super important. And yet, I failed to understand the fact that business, and in particular Danone, could have an impact on them until probably the early 2005. At that moment in time, I followed a commencement speech in the US by a guy called Ray Anderson, who was the chairman and CEO of a company called Interface, which is a US company that manufactures plastic tiles, so carpet and others, plastic, entirely from oil. Mm-hmm. And that Ray had this vision that by transforming its business, he could become climate neutral. That was in 2005, so 15 years ago. When I realized that, it just became obvious for me that if someone like this was going to be able to do that, certainly we could do things on our own side. But the fact is, we didn't even measure the carbon footprint. We had a vague idea about scope 1, maybe scope 2, but scope 3 not at all. And most of our carbon, or the majority of our carbon, is in scope 3. So that was the sort of eureka moment for me, and then for a couple of our colleagues, that led us to embark in 2010 on this carbon reduction program that I mentioned. The real factor happened when we realized, as I was explaining, that carbon was not just somewhere in the books or somewhere in the air, but really in our own business systems. And that we were actually managing carbon without even realizing that. And I think this is really where the journey can start. Understanding what your carbon footprint is, product by product, process by process. It's very easy. I mean, you take your glasses, instead of taking your accounting glasses, you take your carbon glasses, and it works super well. You see that. And then you refine your vision one by one, etc. And then you can decide. And that's just, I'm mentioning carbon because I think, in a way, that's the mother of them all, in a way. It's so holistic in terms of what it embraces that we've seen in agriculture the link with biodiversity. We've seen in agriculture the link with water, obviously, because when you erode soils, there's no carbon structure, and then the water is eroding instead of, and you deplete it. So it had so many ramifications, environmental ramifications, that we felt that it was best to start with that. Right. So to make it shorter, get inspiration, realize that how much impact you can have on climate in your own business, and start understanding the interconnections between all these systems, and go for action, because at the end of the day, it was also creating savings for us. Not always. You have to invest long-term sometime for this. But ultimately, it's about investment. It's about creating a more resilient business. So bringing this into the business, not as a corporate social responsibility program. By the way, the same year where we decided that, we closed our corporate sustainable, our CSR department, basically. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We just close it so that it becomes everybody's responsibility to work on it.
Yes. Now, Ester, Astin, having a scientific framework is, of course, essential for achieving the Paris Agreement. That's why the science-based targets were created. Could you tell us a little bit more about these science-based targets? What are they exactly?
It's an alliance that was established in 2015 by CDP, the UN Global Compact, and the World Resource Institute, and us, WWF, to enable companies to set targets that are aligned with the science is telling us that we need to do to meet the Paris objective of 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. So it's a setting target tool, but we've seen an unprecedented development because 5 years after the launch, now we have more than 1,000 companies that have committed publicly to set those science-based targets. Half of them are more or less in Europe. I think today we have 470 companies who have their targets scientifically approved by the validation tool. And we are seeing companies for more than 60 countries, 50 sectors, and that includes for insurances, food companies like Danone, retailers, energy companies, looking for this target setting. So we need to accelerate it even more. And I think the fact that those companies, and I have the figures here, are very striking. They have a combined market capitalization of over 15 trillion US dollars. I mean, tell us about the weight of such a tool. And there have been few developments that are quite interesting. There was a specific validation tool for SMEs, because that's also where we see a lot of companies, and we discussed it in the roundtable before, looking for solutions and not necessarily see how to do it or it's going to cost me a lot of money. But also now there's a new science-based target framework for the financial sector. And this is where we can also drive billions of investments, from brown investments into the green investments.
Yes. And apart from the science-based targets, what else can businesses and companies do in your mind to fight climate change?
I mentioned the financial sector. I think they have a huge power to change and to really, as I said, shift these investments into more green and sustainable. As Emmanuel explained, I mean, companies can decide how they can reduce their emissions and be accountable for that and demonstrate the progress. An interesting role for us in WWF is when the companies are advocates as well, when they call on policymakers for the change, when they partner with other sectors of activity that they are also pushing for this change. One of my first speaking engagement in WWF was with the wine industry. And it was the wine industry is under an existential threat. I mean, they might disappear. But they didn't know that they could partner with others. Basically, they feel very isolated. And I can tell you that the companies that don't want the change, the fossil fuel, the polluting ones, they know how to get together. So this role of advocates, but also explaining to your consumers why it's important, is very important. And the last word is also what we've seen that has been decisive for climate action in the last years is to have the right climate governance, the right policy frameworks. We also expect companies to support those policy frameworks. And we are talking about the European Union. Right now, we are debating the level of reduction for 2030. Yes. The science tells us it must be 65% by 2030. We might reach climate neutrality by 2040, actually. So we also expect companies to step up and to support those policy frameworks on climate.
Okay. Now, Mathieu Lacroix is another one, another young change maker, and he has the following question for us. Maybe we can see it on the screen. Yes, here it is. Implementing the SDGs requires the involvement of the whole organizations. How do you engage your employees in this process? Now, Emmanuel, Faber, we've talked about this briefly before. I can imagine that for a multinational, it's quite complex to onboard and engage all stakeholders, from employee to shareholders in this process. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you. I won't repeat what I shared earlier about our one person, one voice, one share program. Although I have to say, I think it's fundamental in achieving this goal for us. At least that has been our way to make sure that structurally our people are engaged in this conversation. I think beyond this, I have the most important aspect is that when it says the whole organization is three things. One, you need to deconstruct this SDG framework, which is very much seen as a super high-level thing, global. It's like the UN somewhere. So what I have to do when I am an operator here in Rotselaar factory with that. Deconstruct that to again make sure that people understand what is the impact that they can have on SDGs in what they do every day. And this is why our 9 integrated goals are being discussed with all employees, because they can have an impact on the planet every day here, on the health of people every day here, on the inclusiveness of our growth every day here. It's true for any of us, including finance. One of the waha moment was when the finance team renegotiated a syndicated banking loan of 2 billion euros with 12 of the largest banks in the world by inserting SDG-related metrics in the contracts, so that the more we were making progress on them, the less money we were going to pay to the banks. Mm-hmm. Because basically it meant that these banks believed that Danone would be a less risky company if we were going to apply those than before. So, even finance, and of course, absolutely finance can contribute, but I think 10 years or 15 years ago, you'd ask an accountant at Danone, he would have had no idea how in his job or in her job she could contribute. So deconstruct that. The other aspect is the one I mentioned earlier, I think in my keynote, was the incentive program. The fact that, I've been the vice chairman of the company for some time before becoming the CEO and chairman. As the vice chairman of the company, in some years, driving the margin expansion to its guidance for the company for the year, so the profit expansion, was weighting as much as driving the carbon footprint down in my bonus. And my bonus was actually publicly known by the shareholders. It was disclosed. So I had an equal incentive to work on CO2 as to work on profit. And that was depending on the agenda year by year. But it was really this idea that you need to put your incentives put your money where your mouth is, basically. It's very, very basic. And the last aspect is the governance. I explained about the entreprise à mission, the B Corp movement, yes, etc. I think it's quite important to build organizations where the governance is aligned with basically what you're asking people to do. So it's that, making people aware of what they can do, bring the right incentives, and bring in the right governance for all of this. It looks super easy when I say it in 3 minutes. It's super difficult, but I don't have an easier way than this personally.
Okay. Now, Ester, I think the motto of WWF is together possible. So I can imagine your organization partners up with many stakeholders. Can you briefly share with us some experience or share with us some successful partnerships that you've been working on?
Thanks. Well, it's together possible because what we have to do today is basically we have to reinvent our societies. But we know we can decarbonize the economy and still create jobs. We can change the way we move, we consume, we produce. But this is a huge mission, and WWF, we won't be just, we are just a tiny part of the change. So that's why we are partnering, with many different stakeholders, from other NGOs to companies and businesses, but also researchers and cities as well. And a good example is the Alliance for Climate Action, and I think we'll hear more about the Belgian one very soon.
Yep.
But this is working exactly with cities, with companies, with civil society, with faith groups at local level to really create these platforms for action, to drive action at local level. So we have alliances now set in Argentina, in the US, which is not the most favorable country to work on climate, Japan, Vietnam, Mexico, and other countries. And as I said, they are very unique because they have the goal of really driving ambition from the local to the regional to the national level. They also have the ambition to increase public awareness, public commitment for action on climate as well, but also to engage more the governance to decarbonize our economies and our societies. And an important message also, and lesson learned from those alliances, but also from the work that we do, for instance, on just transition, is that we need to change the way we do policies as well. It can be decision makers deciding on their own. I think people who are going to be the most affected by climate and by this transition need to be involved as well in the decision-making process. And this is how we will manage also to create the ownership for people to take action as well and to support those policies.
Yes. Maybe one last question for you, Jean-Pascal van Ypersele. Collaboration is important. Can you also briefly give us some examples maybe of partnerships, collaborations that were successful for you?
Well, I would mention two kinds of important partnerships I've experienced and I'm experiencing on an almost day-to-day basis. One is within science, and the other one is between science and society. Within science is the partnerships that exist between all the scientists, and there are thousands of them working to produce the IPCC report or the IPWES report. They work across disciplines to answer the policy relevant questions that society in the different countries are asking them. And the other partnership I'm experiencing is the partnership between scientists, policymakers, stakeholders, including business, trade unions, in the Federal Council for Sustainable Development in Belgium, which produces advices to the government in everything related to sustainable development. It's sometimes very difficult to agree on some issues and to find consensus. Consensus is not possible on every subject, actually in science as well. I mean, there is consensus in science on the anthropogenic nature of present climate change, but there isn't consensus on every aspect of climate change and processes. But those partnerships are essential to broaden perspectives and to make society advance towards the achievement of the SDGs.
Thank you very much for this very fruitful discussion. And excuse me for not wearing a mask. I thought it was not going to be necessary since we're 1.5 meters, 2 meters apart from each other. But thank you so much for joining in this discussion. Jean-Pascal van Ypersele, Ester, Astin, and also Emmanuel Faber. Thank you very much. Now, here's what I retain from this morning. It's really urgent to act upon the climate agreement. And if we want to accomplish the United Nations SDG 13 on climate action, it's not too late, but we have to join forces really in order to take bigger steps forward. And partnerships are really crucial for this. And that is why the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action is going to be launched here and now today. And that's the last part of our event. So, I took out my mask as well because we're a little bit closer together here. Let me introduce you to Antoine Lebrun, CEO of WWF Belgium, and also I would like to give the floor to Marie Delvaulx, Director of the Shift. I believe we can first look at the video of what the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action is all about.
Nous voulons rassembler les organisations et les entreprises afin qu'elles échangent les unes avec les autres, qu'elles s'inspirent l'une l'autre et qu'elles définissent des objectifs climatiques ambitieux en ayant les 2 ans.
La bonne nouvelle, c'est que nous avons aujourd'hui les outils qui permettent d'identifier ce qu'il faut faire pour développer une économie bas carbone. Et pour ça, en fait, on met à disposition un outil qui s'appelle les Science-Based Targets et qui permettent aux entreprises de s'inscrire dans une trajectoire qui va respecter l'accord de Paris.
Dit is mogelijk, wij doen het. Wij halen die objectieven, laat ons allemaal samen die objectieven halen. Maar we geloven heel hard dat we nu op een moment komen dat we moeten stoppen met praten en dingen beginnen doen. Dus we hebben heel concrete doelstellingen voor Accenture, maar we willen samenwerken met alle andere NGO's, met alle andere bedrijven, met de overheid en met alle mensen die dit ook van ons verwachten.
Et ces objectifs, ils portent sur toutes les étapes de notre chaîne d'approvisionnement, de la ferme au consommateur final, Nous avons déjà fait de belles avancées dans notre réduction d'empreinte carbone. Néanmoins, faire partie de l'Alliance, pour nous, c'est avoir une plateforme pour pouvoir échanger les bonnes pratiques, pour pouvoir apprendre d'autres organisations, mais aussi pour pouvoir partager nos expériences, nos initiatives.
Wij zijn er echt van overtuigd dat er niets zo praktisch en toepasbaar is dan goede, in de wetenschap gebaseerde doelen en metrieken. Daarom gebruiken wij ze zelf ook om onze eigen doelen meer concreet en tastbaar te maken en echt die transitie naar een carbon neutral organisatie te kunnen maken.
Et développer aussi les solutions énergétiques qui aident nos clients à réduire à leur tour leur empreinte carbone, mais aussi faire des actions au niveau de notre flotte d'entreprises, au niveau de la consommation de nos bureaux. C'est en mettant en commun l'ensemble de ces actions-là qu'on aura une chance d'atteindre la neutralité carbone.
We hebben als missie om zoveel mogelijk goederen via het spoor te vervoeren en daarmee bedrijven te helpen om een klimaatstempel te reduceren. Wij willen partnerships afsluiten met de andere bedrijven om die CO2 verder te reduceren, enerzijds. En wij willen ook langs onze kant nog leren hoe dat wij zelf onze CO2 kunnen reduceren, hoe dat zij daarbij te werk gaan vergelijken met onze methodieken.
So here we are. Antoine, Lebrun, the Shift and WWF are launching the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action. We've seen a little preview, of course, in the movie, but could you explain to us a little bit more in detail what this alliance is exactly?
Well, the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action is actually an alliance that brings together companies that have already committed to science-based targets and companies that are willing to do so. So that those two companies, with the help of the Shift and WWF, can share experiences and can seek inspirations into each other.
Belgium is primarily an SME country. Mm-hmm. Are the science-based targets also applicable to the smaller companies? Ester says something about it, but could you also give your view on this?
Yes, there are two frameworks actually, one for big companies and sectors, and recently there was a new framework that was developed specifically for SMEs, taking into consideration the effort that should be invested into this process to make you carbon on the path to respect the Paris Agreement.
Okay. Now, Marie Delvaulx from the Shift. At the Shift, you are, of course, used to gathering unusual suspects. Why are these partnerships, or is this partnership so important to you?
Well, we are convinced that tackling the challenges we face today, and certainly in these times of crisis, can only be addressed by means of collaboration. So the diversity of our members, being profit, non-profit, but also academic institutions and public institutions, need to talk to each other, and with the expertise we have in that network, we can collaborate and co-create the solutions toward a carbon-neutral society and economy.
Yes. And why did the Shift and WWF collaborate for this particular alliance?
Yes. So we are convinced that through collaboration we can move towards or transition towards a neutral economy and society. And this is why it's really important to get together the different organizations. And we are convinced today that it's actually time for Belgian organizations to join forces, to come together and to exchange and take action around climate actions and set up concrete and ambitious goals.
Yes. Now, Antoine, if an organization should want to join the alliance or would want to know more about it, where can they find information?
So there are two things. There is a website. Normally you should see a QR code on the website that you can scan and go to the website.
Right away? People can
normally
do that right away now.
Yeah. And the second thing is there will be a kind of webinar, online information session that will be organized by the Shift and WWF in a few weeks, where companies can come and have more information about the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action.
Okay. And maybe last word from you, Marie?
Yes, so
So as you see it, I've seen it on the slide, we have today 53 organizations. Half of them had already science-based targets and the other ones hadn't. We onboarded already a lot of organizations, but of course this is an important milestone, the launch of the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action, but still the work needs to happen in the coming months and the coming years. So I would suggest to keep up and update it through the website on the coming activities, because we are going to organize also learning networks, specifically on certain themes such as agriculture, but also on food systems, on finance and so on. So it will be really specific. And the objective, of course, is to make work of it and to collaborate towards that neutral society, carbon neutral society. So,
Marie Delvaulx, yeah?
Yeah, and the last words maybe also is the partnerships. We've heard it. It is really important. And of course, WWF and the Shift, we collaborated intensely, but also with a lot of other organizations. And this is also a good way that through partnerships we can build this kind of alliance.
Thank you very much, Marie Delvaulx and Antoine Lebrun, for explaining everything about the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action. Thank you. Yeah. And well, ladies and gentlemen, this more or less concludes this SDG Changemakers event. I would like to thank, of course, all of the speakers and the panel members for joining us and for their contribution. I would like to thank the people in the room for their presence here, and of course, I would like to thank you all for following us online and Danone for hosting. It's not easy to talk with a mask on your face, but anyhow, for anyone who missed a part of the event or who would like to see it once more, no problem. Keep an eye out on your mailbox, and the Shift will share a link with the recorded version of the event later on. And I would say spread the word. Don't hesitate to use the video to engage your networks, to join the Belgian Alliance for Climate Action, and to become a change maker. Thank you very much. Have a good day.